Daniel Holder of CAJ. This is the second panel session, then you get your lunch. That's the deal, I think. Can I ask the members of the second panel to come up and take their seats at the beginning here? And I'm just going to go through a wee introductory presentation on this particular section, which I think builds on the pretty powerful testimony we've already heard this morning. And what we want to do is just flesh out a bit more of the evidence base of how systemic this is, and also a bit more on the legal framework. I think that last question highlighted things well, too, in the sense that this issue is well known on both sides of the border, but only near the border. It's not really well known in Dublin or in other places, and that's perhaps some of the challenge we have. We're going to start with a picture. It's a wee bit blurred, but I think you can make it out. Gives us a map of the territories that are covered by the Common Travel Area. It's a loose arrangement. There's no treaty. There's no over-binding legislation. Loose arrangement for the last 100 years between the British and Irish states. When I say the British state, I also include the Channel Islands and Isle of Man that are part of the Common Travel Area. But our focus really today is on the land border on this island, which is also the reason why the CTA exists. When you look back at the papers from 100 years ago, that's pretty clear. It was recognised by both governments at a time of partition, the border being created, the Irish Free State being created, that it wasn't going to be possible to do passport checks on such a long and porous border. A border that now has over 500 crossings on it, 500 official crossings, let alone anything else. Indeed, when the Common Travel Area was suspended formally between 1939 and 1952, it was caused by the outbreak of the Second World War, obviously. Passport checks were introduced, but the passport checks were actually introduced between this island and the island of Britain, including passport checks between Northern Ireland and the island of Britain. Not on the land border, so it was recognised that just wasn't possible. And a lot of what we're discussing today is about internal border controls. That is really the crux of what the Common Travel Area is to an extent. And I just think it's helpful to tease that out at two levels, because it's two things. I've got them at the top of the slide. One is passport control. Do you, or who has to carry a passport, who is under a duty to carry and produce a passport when crossing the land border or an internal CTA border? But also, regardless of that, who is under a duty to seek some sort of prior immigration permission to cross the border, be that a visa or be that something else? I've included an extract there from a memorandum of understanding, the post-Brexit one, that was signed by the UK and Ireland. It's a non-binding memorandum of understanding. Some people, I'm sure, have seen this. Yeah, a few people nodding in the audience. They will have seen this. It sets out what the Common Travel Area is, and that's not entirely inaccurate, but it's a little misleading. And I think the post-Brexit discussion has created a bit of a historical impression about what the Common Travel Area has been about. It says that it's an arrangement that facilitates the ability of our citizens to move freely within the CTA, and then it makes reference, albeit it doesn't say the Common Travel Area, that associated reciprocal rates for British and Irish citizens in the alternate jurisdiction have existed since Ireland's independence. That may well be the case, but that was nothing to do with the Common Travel Area. Mostly for the last 50 years to do with the EU Free Movement Law, and at the beginning actually it was to do with Irish citizens still being considered under British law as subjects of the British Empire. That was where reciprocal rates came from. The reason why I'm raising this, which is a slight distraction from our issues about border controls, is it has led to the common impression that's mostly fueled by government discourse that the Common Travel Area has always just been for British and Irish citizens. And that ain't true. Even when you look at the legislation that's currently in place, and even when you look at historically how it's evolved, that ain't true. The problem is, it's never applied to everybody. And we've heard the impact of that already today. That's the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding. There was a previous Memorandum of Understanding between the two governments on the common travel area is in 1952. Has anyone seen that? It's a trick question, actually. Nobody has seen it. It was kept secret by the two governments. You think, why? Well, why? Because the other element of the common travel area is really policing the external border of the CTA and cooperation between the two governments that's been quite secretive. If you think about it, I said 1952, the Second World War didn't end then, did it? It ended in 1945. Ireland was up for re-establishing the common travel area. The UK refused, unless Ireland capitulated to a British demand that Ireland would introduce the same types of immigration controls as that the UK was introducing at that point. And ultimately Ireland capitulated in 1952 and did so, but given as it was so embarrassing for a newly proclaimed republic to say that publicly, the MOU was kept secret. The MOU from 2019 is not secret, and in fact it makes reference to the two governments having a common travel area forum. So in this new era of transparency, we got the minutes of this forum under Freedom of Information to see what it was up to, and that's what we got. I think the reason for this is it's still quite secretive, because the external area of the common travel area is about the two states policing each other's borders, and that's quite politically embarrassing for a number of reasons. This is why we have seen incidents of the Gardaí getting on the Belfast bus at Dublin Airport and asking people for ID. Sure, these are passengers who have already come through passport control in the airport, so why would you do that? Maybe go some way to answering Colin's question about checks on both sides in the border. The pattern we see is that checks are done by the Gardaí because the UK's checks have essentially been subcontracted to the Gardaí because it's politically untenable, and there isn't a PSNA formal role, and there's a bit of mission creep sometimes. There isn't a PSNA formal role in immigration control that's done by the UK Border Force. It's not politically tenable to have British border guards on the land border conducting checks, so it doesn't happen. It's not politically tenable with nationalism. Equally, it's not politically tenable with unionism to have the same checks being conducted on the Irish Sea, which is why it is actually done, but it's done very informally and without any proper legal basis, and we'll go into that as we go on. I just want to give you a sense then of those two things, of what the legal framework currently is for those two areas that I identified. Passport controls on the one hand, who has to carry a passport, who doesn't, and then on the other hand, who has to apply for prior permission before crossing the border. If you look at UK law exempts all journeys on the land border from passport control for all citizenships. There is no legal basis at all for passport control. It is not restricted to British and Irish citizens. That ain't true. That doesn't actually stop the UK Home Office from operating outside the legal framework and conducting checks, but it tends to do them on ferries and flights between the North and Britain. And apparently these checks are entirely voluntary, because they have no legal basis. That also means we don't have any statistics for them, because they don't really exist. It's not a formal exercise of a statutory power. Irish law, if you think the UK practice is bad, the Irish law is even worse, because it's inherently discriminatory. So the legislation says that if you're crossing the land border, there is no duty to carry and produce passports if you are Irish or if you are British. It also says in one bit of legislation, but not another, if you're exercising established EU rights, and that's the only basis British citizens, until British specifically added after Brexit, were able to cross the border. But everyone else who doesn't fall into those categories does have a duty to carry and produce passports. And we've already heard that from Nina and others in the first panel. That prompts some very obvious questions. How do you tell who is British, Irish, etc., and who is not? Who is asked for a passport? Even if everyone is asked for a passport, who is told, aye, that's okay, when they don't have one? And who is probed further, or perhaps detained? If you have a piece of legislation that inherently discriminates, there is going to be a value judgment conducted by a law enforcement officer as to who they think looks British and Irish and who doesn't. And the form of racial discrimination that we call racial profiling, i.e. when law enforcement officers single out people on skin colour and other ethnic indicators, is absolutely inevitably going to happen. And it does. And probably everyone in this room, most people in this room will have seen it themselves. Some of the odd responses, and Nina mentioned it, one of the responses on the floor of the Oireachtas was that everyone has to carry ID to cross the border. Now that simply isn't true, and there would be rather an outbreak of unrest in Derry if the entire population were told they would have to take their passports to cross into Donegal. That doesn't happen. There is a very selective system. In terms of permission to cross the border, under UK law, yeah, there's a hard border for UK visa nationals. If you're crossing south to north, you need a visa if you're a visa national. British, Irish, EU and other non-visa nationals, so that's people who aren't EU citizens but don't require UK visas, like people from the Americas, etc. At the moment, there is no requirement for immigration permission, can freely cross the border. You see, common travel area isn't just for British and Irish citizens. There's been a big battle to keep it like that though, over the post-Brexit electronic travel authorisation. The British government has backed down and said that anyone resident in the south won't require that. We're working out the details of that now, but visitors will. Under Irish law, similar sort of thing occurs. There's a hard border for Irish visa nationals, and we've heard that already. Can't cross from north to south without a visa. For others, there's no usual prior permission requirements. So what happens? Well, we know what happens in terms of this particular system. I'll give you one example. A guy called Jules Zinoker, an insurance lawyer, who was on one trip to Scotland, which involves getting on the ferry at Belfast, getting off in Scotland, going to his meetings, getting back on the ferry in Scotland and getting back off it in Belfast. So that's 4 times. On each and every one of those 4 occasions, he was the only black fella in the queue, was the only one pulled out of the queue, was the only one asked for a passport. 4 times in one journey. And that happens north-south too, as we've heard. So what are we looking for here in terms of asks for changes? And I suppose the first point is this is all really easy and all really deliverable if the political will was there. It's actually quite straightforward. What we have is a number of issues for Irish law and policy and a number of issues for UK law and policy as well. The first issue is to remove the hard border for visa nationals. And remember, this isn't even an immigration issue. This is people already resident on this island. So it shouldn't be thrown into the border debates. There's remove the hard border by allowing people some form of deemed leave, which is what non-visa nationals, say in the south, already have to cross to the north. So for both countries, it would just be amending legislation, but there's no reason for one to await the other, particularly when there'd be more political will at the moment in Dublin than London. The Irish government could just get on and do this. Second one is amend Irish law to end all passport checks on the land border. The duties, you either have passport checks or you don't. It's as simple as that. Any differential approach is inevitably going to lead to racial discrimination. There are other issues when we get into a discussion about reversing the changes to citizenship law, allowing people who are resident in the north for decades to be able to naturalise as Irish citizens. That would remove the need for visas and hard borders and stuff. There's an issue for both states in terms of essential cross-border services being open to all residents. That's one of the problems with that 2019 MOU. It talks about essentially reciprocal arrangements for cross-border provision, but only talks about it in relation to British and Irish citizens, which is a problem, because it needs to be there for everyone who crosses the border. And the UK should also end its selective passport controls on CTA routes. So that's the introductory presentation. I'm now going to turn to the panel discussion. I've been told my job is to keep everyone to time, which I probably have just not done myself. It's not so bad. So we have 4 expert panel members who are going to give contributions from their different perspectives on the subject matter that we're focusing on. I'm going to start with Alison Kilpatrick, who is and people are more than welcome either to come up here or just to stay at the seats, whatever you prefer. Alison is the Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and is going to give some perspective from the Commission about some of the issues we've been discussing today. So thank you.
I've been well warned, so I'm going to keep it very brief and just whiz through a few points. But let me say how pleased I am to be here, and just how powerful I found that first panel. It shamed me a little, actually sitting in the front row listening to that, and I just hoped we were better than that, but clearly we're not yet. So Daniel has talked about, or implied, the limitations of the Common Travel Area. I agree. The two commissions, so North and South, published a detailed analysis which includes the impact of Brexit, and I invite you to look at that. But what we note, at least, not least among its limitations, is the absence of proper legal underpinning, and we keep coming back to this, particularly acute now in the absence of supporting EU law. We suggest the rights offered in the Common Travel Area should be underpinned by a new UK-Ireland bilateral treaty, and we'll continue to call for that. The CTA rights have been shaken further by measures such as the Nationality and Borders Act, which we've also analysed. In short, resulting changes to the immigration rules mean that an electronic travel authorisation will be required for many non-British, non-Irish visitors to Ireland who wish to travel to Northern Ireland. They will apply broadly to visitors who do not need a visa for short stays, such as EU nationals, and who do not have any other UK immigration status. Now, we wrote and communicated our concern in 2021 to the Home Secretary, particularly our concern that restrictions and related checks would, at best, increase racial profiling. And I'm not going to say increase the risk of racial profiling, because it already exists, and we've heard that it exists. So I'm not asking for evidence of racial profiling. Let's accept that it happens, and let's try and reduce it happening. We raised the engagement of and potential breach of Article 8 of the European Convention, right to private family life, particularly for border communities. And now the context is important here. Under the Windsor Framework, the UK Government committed to avoiding a hard border, including related checks and controls, and gave suitable undertakings. We recommended that all journeys from Ireland to Northern Ireland be exempt from ETA requirements, and other people in this room have worked as hard at trying to secure a change in this policy. In March this year, the UK Government conceded that third country nationals who are resident in Ireland and from a nationality, it's a bit of a mouthful, that does not usually require a visa to visit the UK will be exempt from requiring an ETA to enter the UK. This has partially addressed concerns, but people not resident in Ireland still need ETA to travel from Ireland to Northern Ireland. Now, I go back to the more general point. I thought we were better than this. This is not what Belfast Good Friday Agreement was about, and it's not what the protections in the Windsor Framework were supposed to be about. Belfast Good Friday Agreement protects everyone in the community, and just so you know, should you be in any doubt, that includes asylum seekers and refugees, and we're very happy to say that it does. So, Home Office assured us that there would not be immigration controls within the Common Travel Area, with none on the Northern Ireland land border. Now, that may be a nicety in terms of exactly where checks may or may not be carried out, but they've said they will be purely intelligence-led. Now, I've worked in policing for a long time, looking at human rights. Intelligence-led is a mysterious concept, and as Nina said, it appears to be anything but the reasoning for certainly stopping people on the buses. We also believe the fragility of the Common Travel Area arrangements and complexity of rights after Brexit have further complicated matters, and that prompted us to further research, and we're looking forward to publishing some research on, for example, rights of frontier workers. We have published some on the right to health. As we heard, and I'm going to finish. I can feel Daniel's presence, as friendly as it is. So I would invite you to look out for our research, and we'll certainly circulate it to you, because we'd like to share that with you. As we heard from the first panel, the hardening of the border is having a profound effect on the everyday life of many in our community. And they are in our community. These are not people apart from our community, and they should enjoy it just as much as we do. significant challenges to key shared services and facilities, such as the cross-border healthcare system, and we can talk more about that on the questions if necessary, but we have some research on that. So the introduction of hurdles to free movement in the island and UK immigration rules will affect migrant and minority ethnic communities accessing healthcare, and we're concerned about that. You need to know, everyone, what you're entitled to, and we want to work with you to try and achieve that, but certainly we're there to answer questions. So I'm going to speed through and simply leave it, I think, to hear from our other three experts here, and simply say that part of our job is here to make sure you're welcomed if you're an asylum seeker or refugee, whatever your status may be. This is supposed to be a great island. British and Irish people are supposed to be welcoming, and let's ensure that we actually prove that to the people who need it most. So thank you.
Thanks, Alison. The Human Rights Commission being one of the Good Friday Agreement bodies that was set up, Zyrek here as well, in terms of a new dispensation. We always remind ourselves it's called human rights for a reason, not citizens' rights. The rights are attached to humans, not citizens. I think that's quite important for our discussion. I'm actually just going to take the speakers in the order you're sitting. You may come up here, you may remain seated, it's entirely up to you, but Dr. Omar Al-Qadri is chair of the Irish Muslim Council, is our next speaker, and is going to talk about the impacts of racial discrimination in relation to border checks and their community impacts.
Cordial Assalamu alaikum. First of all, Corey Milimagov to the Committee on Administration of Justice and the Northwest Migrants Forum for organizing this important event. I moved to Ireland 20 years ago, 2003, and I moved from the Netherlands. I was born and raised in the Netherlands. So I obviously did not have to go through any of the challenges that we are hearing about today. But the community that I represent, and the Irish Muslim community, is a community that is in the south 100,000 strong, 100,000 members. And that has changed. In 2003 there were approximately only 15,000 Muslims. And now we have 100,000 Muslims. And the Muslim community is a very diverse community. People from all different nations, countries represent and are part of this community. The issue that we're talking about isn't really only affecting, of course, the Muslim community. It affects every single minority community. I was married in Pakistan, so my wife was a Pakistani national. She was affected by this. And I must, just before I share the experience, I think that the CTA agreement, obviously, when it came into force in 1922, Ireland was a completely different Ireland than now. But the sad part is that in 2019 or 21, when they signed the MOU, they disregarded that Ireland is not the same Ireland as 100 years ago. It has changed. It's a very pluralist Ireland. It's a very diverse Ireland. This is just the Muslim community, but we've got 100,000 Polish people, we've got thousands and thousands of people from other parts of the world. They were completely disregarded. And that's very sad that they were completely disregarded. So my wife, as I said, was from Pakistan, and back in the days, the Nuri was very well known among the Muslim community, most of them doctors that worked around there, for being relatively cheaper than the South. So a lot of people would go to do their shopping to Nuri. Every time I had to go, I wanted to go, I had to go alone, couldn't go with my wife, because she had a Pakistani passport, she didn't have the British visa. The British visa itself, to get the British visa, I remember waking up 5 o'clock in the morning to stand in front of the British embassy, a long queue of 200 people, and then the whole process was, nerve-wracking. It wasn't about the money. Of course, you have to pay money as well, but it was about the energy that you have to spend. So then, so my wife faced that, but then when I was the imam, and I started giving spiritual counseling to people living in the north also, or those people living very close to Donegal and Letterkenny, etc., I found out about the struggles that people have. We've heard of some of these experiences. But I remember one Muslim sister wearing a hijab who was very distressed because she was stopped in the public transport, and she felt it so much that she was in depression for the next few weeks, because she said it wasn't just the skin color, it was the fact that she was wearing a hijab also, and she felt that everybody in the bus was looking at her when she was asked to provide a passport. Some of the doctors that live and work in hospitals aren't able to travel because they don't have the visa, either of the UK, either those that are living and working in Northern Ireland, they don't have the visa of Ireland. So we've heard of these struggles and challenges. I was studying in the Irish School of Economics many years ago, and I had a student, a fellow student who was from India. He had an Irish visa, and we had a trip to go to Belfast in the intercultural, interreligious studies program. He was a fantastic student. He wasn't able to go because he didn't have a British visa. It was very sad. So we heard today stories about people coming from the north to the south, but also people that actually have work permits, they have visas, that live here in the south aren't able to go to the north also. So I think that the governments, they need to really think about making the island of Ireland really inclusive and equal for everybody. You know, it's not about whether you're a citizen of Ireland or Britain. It's about if you are living in Ireland legally, whether you have a visit visa, whether you have a work permit, you should be entitled to travel to the south or from the south to the north. And not being able to do so is something that I think shows that you're treated differently. You are the other. You don't have the British and Irish passport, so you're going to be treated differently. So I think it is wrong, particularly for people, as I said, that have already a legal status, those that have a work permit, those that have already visas, visit visas. And if people from India or China, for example, can come to the UK on a British visa, and they're entitled to come to Ireland also on the same visa, what stops the Irish government for adopting this for all people? What stops the British government from allowing people with an Irish visa, legal Irish visa, to at least, I'm not asking that they can visit England, I'm asking that at least they can visit the north of Ireland, the same island of Ireland that has the same culture, the same landscape, and is of course welcoming for all, and we must show that, I think, as people of government. So this is some of this experience and thoughts that I have regarding the CTA, and I hope that we will find our governments will find a solution that will make Ireland inclusive and equal for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we've had the Human Rights Commissioner, we've had the community leader, both giving a sort of broad demonstration of how systemic some of these problems are. We're going to move specifically back to the university sector and the Innocent picked up some of these issues earlier on, but our third panellist, Philip, is going to further elaborate on how the CTA impacts the university sector.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm delighted to be here to contribute to these very important issues. As an educator based in the north, largely travelling between Derry and Belfast with no restriction, the issues around the common travel area clearly cause challenges in the arena of education, and I'm going to focus specifically on further and higher education. In the context of the issues discussed today, there are clearly many individual students who are denied the right to travel freely throughout the island of Ireland to access the whole range of educational opportunities on the island. But in the further and higher education sector, I'd also just introduce how this also relates to the mobility and individual opportunities of professional educators and workers in the education sector as well. What I would say in this very brief intervention is that, of course, the experts are those students and staff who are impacted themselves, and we heard very forcefully from the first panel. However, I'm here as a social scientist, a university lecturer, and a board member of Northwest Migrants Forum. I just put that out there as well. Working in a large institution where you're dealing also with these challenges and trying to change process and practice from within as well. In an increasingly globalised Ireland, of course, that educational space is becoming an ever increasingly important aspect of our society for training, but also for instigating creativity, new ideas, and also, of course, in challenging inequality itself, contributing to debates around our public services and the issues they're facing, and making improvements to society for all. We do have to acknowledge, though, that for those ideals to flourish, mobility, connections, crossovers, and easily facilitated collaborations between all resident students and education staff are vital. If we can't easily facilitate this on this island, then this is damaging to our island's wider educational space. But of course, also the current application of the Common Travel Area can act to create deep inequalities in access to education itself and in the career opportunities of those working within it. Of course, these issues that we've been talking about have, when applied to education, had particular relevance for international students, visa nationals, and their families. The different tiered approach that Lillian mentioned earlier also shows that even after Brexit, students from predominantly wealthy white countries still face fewer barriers than those from countries in the global south. We're still seeing, whilst there's more bureaucracy there since Brexit, it is nowhere near the restrictions that other students face. These are challenges which will continue to grow in prevalence given the changing nature of further and higher education, which has seen ever increasing numbers of international students. Just to give you an example, in Northern Ireland, the Department for Economy has suggested around 10,500 international students at Queen's and Ulster University in 2021-22. That's an increase from 4,000 in 2018, 2019. So you can see the rapid change that we've seen in the last couple of years. And there's nuanced reasons for that as well. So this is becoming particularly pronounced. Even beyond individual factors, there are reasons to take the barriers to cross-border education more seriously. For example, recent reports by the Higher Education Policy Institute and Universities UK International noted that international students' input into the local economy in Northern Ireland alone accounts for almost £1 billion. That is in a system where so many students already face real barriers and borders in studies and their professional life. So the benefits, with much less restrictive bureaucracy, I suppose, and restrictions on people's lives, could enhance that societal benefit much better. We also have seen a growing awareness of cooperation and collaboration on educational matters, north and south generally. And we've especially seen matters in the border regions in recent months come to fruition. So for example, in my own region, in the Northwest, forgive me for using the Northwest as an example, but I think it perfectly highlights many of the issues that we're talking about today. The Irish government, of course, has invested heavily in the development of the Atlantic Technological University campus in Letterkenny, and more recently announced a £50 million investment in Ulster University's Derry campus, just 16 miles apart, these two campuses. So cross-border collaboration clearly matters for the future. However, many of those living at border regions will not have the same opportunities of access and choice as those benefiting fully from the Common Travel Area. It's not always a given that someone currently living in Derry can make full use of these investments by studying in Letterkenny and then progressing to a further degree across the border in Derry, for instance. I know from experience of working with some postgraduate researchers in the Northwest, they may not be able to collaborate with other institutions across the island. They may not be able to gather data, the very fabric of their study. They may not be able to share the findings of their research if they're studying in Derry, in Donegal. And even though, using the border region as an example, there are equally acute areas for someone, for example, studying in Cork, who then cannot take part in a supposedly all-island conference in Belfast. So it's quite an absurd way of thinking about things. The current manifestation of the CTA in education, therefore, causes challenges in multiple ways. It stymies individual opportunity, but it also curtails true development of wider knowledge, the advance of collective enterprise, and social, educational, and cultural capital. One of the things also that's really important in education is the need to engage and learn from professional knowledge, often held within communities themselves, within grassroots organisations, for example. So such knowledge exchange through things like practice teaching, where experts in applied areas may come and speak to students about particular issues. I'm thinking social work, nursing, medicine, community development. We're restricted from sometimes sharing that knowledge because the very professionals who we want to come and talk to our students find those difficulties in crossing the border themselves. As I said at the beginning, good education is premised on dialogue and opportunities for exchange, and if we can't remove the barriers to sharing in ways which are of benefit to everyone on the island, then this is not serving our best interests. Finally, and I think part of this event is contributing hugely to this today, I think further work, typical academic, so I'm always going to finish and say we need further work, but further work and more qualitative data I think is very powerful. We can gather quantitative data, of course, but qualitative data from international students about the nuances of this issue, because you see the complexity of it and how it impacts on individual lives in multiple different ways. Those stories of individual challenges are really powerful in teasing out the problems caused by the common travel area in its current guise, but they don't just evidence individual challenges. As a sociologist, I would argue that they present how the lived experiences are caused by the decisions that are taken by those at the structural level in powerful positions. And therefore, that's the connection I think that this campaign needs to break in talking to those who have the power and the authority to contribute to some positive change in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for going through all of that and showing how what a pretty pointless CPA rules are pretty much running a wrecking ball through universities, and that's just one sector. If we had the time, we could present a whole lot of other sectors and the impacts on it. But you finished on the need for empirical data, which is a wonderful handover to Dr. Lucy Michael, who's going to tie everything together really nicely, because there is a very significant evidence base of all of these problems that has been gathered, and I'll just hand over to Lucy to take us through some of it, and then we'll open up for questions and answers.
Do I need that or that way?
That's not working. That might actually be working now.
Is that working? Yes? Marvellous. Thanks, Daniel. Well, maybe I'm going to let Daniel down a little bit because I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm going to cover my favourite topic, I'm afraid. Data is one of the things that I'm most passionate about, because when we look to change policy or legislation, having data is one of the most powerful tools we have. Narratives are hugely important. We need them to interpret and to carry the data, but so much of the work requires actually having evidence that we can put in front of policymakers. Now, recently, the Economic and Social Research Institute undertook a report on the shared island commissioned by the government, and in that they looked particularly at issues around employment, around health and so on, around migrant integration across the island. The most important chapter for me and for this campaign is the one on migrant experiences of cross-border travel, and so I want to start there, and then I want to take you through really where data is missing and the problem that causes for us in looking at this problem. So what they asked was, what is migrants' experience of cross-border travel for work or personal reasons? And in that discussion, the border checks and racial profiling were a consistent theme in relation to almost every one of the issues that have come up here today already. I should say I was lucky enough to be an advisor on this project. I wasn't one of the researchers, so I won't take any credit for the work that they did in this. And it was excellent work because it captured some of that qualitative data that Philip talks about being so necessary, hearing from people and their lived experiences. So let me just take you into some of that very quickly. What we found in that research was instances of profiling during checks where nationality mattered much less than their profile. Skin colour, the language spoken, their accent and their name. Many incidents of racial profiling where particular groups of people were asked to produce their passports. Now, it wasn't a new issue, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the historical data on that, but it was heightened following Brexit, and that was very clear to everybody and all of the organisations that took part in that consultation. While the immigration rules for non-EEA migrants hadn't changed, participants reported the frequency of incidents of racial profiling had increased massively, with people being asked to produce identity documents, as Nina talked about earlier, having to produce a document even to show you don't need a document. And so participants said things like, there was discrimination and it's ongoing, it's not new, it was always there, but that Brexit has made it worse in some cases. It's important to acknowledge that. Now, some migrants cannot cross the border, but because there's no routine border controls, non-white individuals are targeted for checks on the basis of race or ethnicity, while white migrants were much less likely to be stopped. And consultation participants described something which actually is very difficult to capture in the data. They described a fear around approaching and crossing the border. Now, fear is a very difficult thing to capture because, as Nina said, there were so many ways in which one avoids the thing that you fear the most. And we cannot count the number of journeys that have been avoided, the number of funerals, weddings, parties, birthdays missed, the number of sporting engagements people have not participated in, the number of healthcare appointments not attended or not taken up, and perhaps the number of healthcare checks not engaged in. There are so many things we cannot count. But what we can try and count is at least some of those most damaging incidents. And when the ESRI asked about that fear of that people engaged with, they said they felt constrained from engaging in travel due to racial profiling, even when they had a right to do so, even when they had documents. Why? They were worried about being stopped, particularly by the Gardaí, not just UK authorities, but particularly by the Garda Síochána. And they said, let me give you a quote, people want to live their lives legally, they want to live in the open, and the fear that any small incident or connection with authorities by accident or by necessity would unravel their lives is a significant challenge and fear underpinning most of this. People do not want to be deported, they do not want to lose their visas, they do not want to have their children's education, their homes, etc. disrupted. And that fear runs through everything. So what do we know about the checks that are actually taking place? Well, there's some data available. We know that checks have taken place at ferry ports and airports, and CIJ have published much of this data. We know that checks have been conducted internally in Belfast, Newry, Derry, Craigavon and Enniskillen. And we know that between 2012 and 2019, Romanian, Chinese and British nationals were the most common nationalities stopped in immigration checks. Again, the data that's missing is the informal immigration checks that are not recorded. Many of the boarding of buses are not recorded in any of that data. Now, I want to really importantly put this in a wider context of race and policing, because again, there's a data issue there which speaks to some of the issues we're dealing with in this Share the Island campaign. And there's an intersection here between two very key issues. One is racial profiling on the island of Ireland, and one is how racial profiling comes up as one of the most terrifying aspects of this border. So let me just run into that briefly, because I want to show you the depths of where data is useful and not useful in this. We know that there's patterns of discrimination across Europe for Roma and people of African descent, particularly Muslims since 2001, and particularly for asylum seekers and other migrants, and I want to say particularly since 2015. So just to highlight the kind of key things that have been ramping up anxiety and real experience of policing for each group. Racial profiling is one of the key drivers of disproportionate representation in custody, and because of that, EU law takes it seriously. Unfortunately, all of the investment that EU agencies have made into racial profiling and training of police forces across Europe has not adequately translated into the area of immigration, which is what we're concerned about today. And that is really problematic for us. The other thing too, of course, is that Garda Síochána since 2011 have been denying that they undertake racial profiling at all, and they've denied it consistently, and they've denied it through UN and European international responsibility forums. So profiling that's based solely or mainly on one characteristic amounts to direct discrimination under every set of EU laws that are available. But it's really hard to claim that and really hard to prove it. Why? There's no official data gathered in Ireland on ethnicity in police stops, identity checks, vehicle stops, or searches of persons, homes, or vehicles. Were that data available and collected in respect of the general population, we would have data on how much it affects people crossing the border. But we don't, in part because Garda Síochána and the Department of Justice have so far refused to put in, let me leave them a way out, have so far refused to put that in. They always say that's the first rule of negotiation, right? Leave everybody a way out. And because that ethnic data is not gathered and not disaggregated, we simply don't know. Let me show you a couple of things we do know. We do know that a Garda Inspectorate report recently found that people with a nationality other than Irish constituted 17% of those in a sample of people in custody, compared to 12% of the general population. We know that the Polish and Romanian people are overrepresented in the prison population. Again, remember I said that they were subject to immigration checks on buses and borders. And we know the group that is most overrepresented in Irish prisons is people of African nationality. Now, half of those born in Africa or of African descent in Ireland are actually Irish citizens, so they don't appear in these prison statistics. That's another data gap. And we know that many of the reports to the Irish Network Against Racism on racial profiling on the border have been from people of African descent. So they're not captured in this. This is where some of the data is throwing up these issues. And we know that complaints to the Garda Síochána Ombudsman recently, the first time they had ever published it was just 2 years ago, 10% of complaints were made by people who were Black, Asian or traveller, and 5% by others. So Black, Asian and traveller numbers of complaints were all double the rate of their representation in the general population. And those are just the complaints that actually got made and recorded by the Ombudsman. Irish law has a lot of grounds for detention of asylum seekers and unauthorised migrants, but there's no record of them during detainment in Garda stations on immigration charges. Legal aid is not available, and although they have a right to interpreter, there are well evidenced problems with accessing interpreters in Garda stations in Ireland. INAR is one of the organisations, along with CAJ and Deportations Belfast, North West Migrant Forum, who have been encouraging members of the public to report racial profiling on buses. We would love to see more of that data coming in, and particularly where people have experienced it multiple times, to have reports on each of those. It's part of building that data, that database. But in 2022, let me tell you that 5 cases recorded by INAR referred specifically to discrimination on racial grounds by Gardaí. 2 of those resulted in serious injury. Between 2017 and 2021, there were 36 cases about Garda discrimination, and that's about treatment during stops, searches, seizures, arrests and detention. We know that ethnic minorities and migrants in Garda custody are much more vulnerable to mistreatment or failure to provide their full rights than other members of the public. And that we've seen that echoed, and this is my last point, we've seen it echoed in all of the condemnations by UN and EU bodies of Ireland's failure to prohibit racial profiling. So since the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland in 2011 published the report some of you will know called Singled Out, and since the 2014 Dole questions on traveller profiling, we have had the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination twice condemn Ireland on its failure to prohibit racial discrimination. We've had the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for Protection of National Minorities, who were just in Dublin again this week, have condemned the Irish authorities for failing to address through policing the breach of discipline that discrimination should constitute. We've had the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance remind the Irish government that they must prohibit this. And during COVID-19, the Policing Authority of Ireland actually published a series of reports highlighting mistreatment of young black men in towns across Ireland. So we know this is a live issue. We know that international bodies are alive to it, and yet we haven't yet seen any action on data collection or legislation from government. What we have seen is just one thing that gives us a little bit of hope is the new Garda Powers Bill on stop and search. Unfortunately, it also includes a catch-all for warrantless searches, and the new National Action Plan contains only one action on improvement in policing, and it does not address racial profiling. So I don't leave you with a very optimistic view, I'm afraid, but I think it's worth knowing where our issues on data in this campaign interact with others, and I hope that that's a helpful summary. Thank you.
That was an incredibly helpful summary, and you packed so much into a relatively short period of time, and made very clear both the amount of evidence there is there as to what's going on, but also the intentional data gaps that are created simply by data not being gathered in the way it should. We have a bit of time for questions. There will be there's one there, there will be, I think someone has a roving mic, otherwise I'm going to have to, I don't know, throw this one. We'll take the 2 questions.
Thank you for these rather presentations. My name is Gyuti Chakravarti, and I'm a postdoc at UCC, and I'm actually working on an HEA-funded project called Women of the Borderlands, which is funded through its North-South research program. But the interesting thing that I wanted to share here is that being an Indian national with an Indian passport, I had to apply for a visa to go do my fieldwork in the north. And that was delayed because, of course, in the month of May, there were just a round of these bank holidays which delayed my visa application by about 3 weeks, which meant that I couldn't go into the field until July to do my fieldwork. So again, on the question of having qualitative data and capturing fear and the challenges around capturing that fear, like, you know, for me to even consider going on a holiday to Donegal is out of question when I don't have a visa. And this is when I'm married to a British national. So these questions are always on my mind, like, you know, even trying to do field work in border counties. And I was just up in Clones the other week, and I was at the Family Resource Centre, and you have something that I'm coming across more and more is people talking about how the demography of some of these towns are changing. Because again, a lot of the asylum seekers are housed in very, very rural areas in the Republic of Ireland. And some of these rural areas are extremely close to the border as well. So the challenges that throws up for people, so yeah. And on the question of, you know, the CTA being brought up in the CTA sort of coming into effect in 1921 after the formation of the Irish Free State. I think one thing that I'm coming up in the literature as I write a paper is the fact that the CTA actually allowed for travel for Commonwealth nationals until 1939. And I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And in 1952, there was from 1952 onwards, there was this anxiety that East African Asians who were British subjects would use Ireland as a landing point to cross over to the UK. And I think this is something that needs to be kept in mind, that the CTA has always been racialized. There has been nothing common about the CTA. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. Complexities of the CTA and also the difficulties. I mean, one of the responses to the media commentary today was, oh, well, there is this option, Lillian, you alluded to it, of a sort of 5-year visa. It's not easy to get a visa. It's not it'll be an option for some people, but it's extremely complex. And there is no visa scheme designed for the group of people we're talking about today in terms of northern residents. So if we move on to the second question, then we'll open it up to the panel. So Ken here at the front.
Thanks very much. My name is Ken Fraser. I suppose I'm a freelancer now. So I found that the entire morning fascinating. I found it very interesting. What I do notice, though, is that when you come to talk about the CTA, it's as though this was a jumble. It was a historical jumble. It emerged out in some sort of way, piecemeal sort of way, and that it was just there and it just happened to have occurred, and that that anyone with the right mind would actually be wanting to do something about the CTA because it denied so many possibilities, so many richnesses that could be got there. Call me cynical, but I think that CTA is there for a purpose, and I think it's there for the particular purpose of, if Sunak ever gets to stop the boats, then he'll be worried about boatloads of people coming from the south to the north on the island of Ireland. And I think that's specifically what you've actually got to address there. I think that this is part of the hostile environment, or the defence against large numbers of asylum seekers fetching up in the UK. And I think that that needs to be explicit and it needs to be put out there when you're actually negotiating with, for instance, the Home Office or whatever government bodies you're negotiating with. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much. You're picking up the issues of the sort of dark side of the common traveller, and that it's about very restrictive practices, not just the internal borders issues. Just to say, the Illegal Migration Act, as well, this awful draconian piece of legislation that's just gone through Westminster, those duties to deport persons, although it's all flagged rhetorically around small boats, do actually apply to the land border as well. There's no distinction made. I'm going to hand over to all members of the panel, open it up to all members of the panel who want to comment on any of those questions, and we might have time for one or two last questions before we go. Lucy, you're volunteering.
Yeah. Couldn't resist the opportunity to respond to Ken's question. I think what I've noticed over the last number of years is, I've often recommended to people books or podcasts on the hostile environment, is how few people in Ireland have really been interested in that. And the tendency to believe that the hostile environment is about England, Scotland and Wales and not about our island, while we have this border re-emerging. And I think actually that language of hostile environment is very helpful to think about that. I was struck recently in a conversation with somebody who works in the Home Office to find out that every single person who is moving jobs within the Home Office has now been put on the small boats desk, and there is no option except to leave your job or to join the small boats desk in the Home Office. I think the ramping up of that is terrifying, to be very honest. So I do think it's helpful for us to acknowledge the way in which the CTA interacts with these other agendas, like I said, the racial profiling issues and the hostile environment and so on. I think we just have to be very aware of that this exactly what happened. The 2004 referendum on Irish citizenship precisely came around because of a Chinese birth in Belfast, specifically connected to that one case. And so I think the Irish government is very quick to jump on anything that looks like it's around enforcing borders, and I think we have to not be lax about that.
Thank you. Any other panel members?
I'd just like to respond just to Judy's comments and research, and thank you for the intervention there. And I think one of the things that I think what you were saying there is not to forget the historical embeddedness of this issue as well, that we're talking about it in contemporary context, but clearly, I don't have to, speak to the converted here, but, migration is not a new phenomenon, and I think we can look back at the past, and a bit of a historian, we can look back on the past to see those patterns, the way that discourse has been used in the past, the way that othering has been used in the past, the way that moral panics have been used in the past, and I think that kind of historical aspect to this issue is absolutely vital as well. Of course it's an issue embedded in the contemporary, but we replicate these problems and these mistakes time and time and time again, and I think, looking back to the 1930s, the 1950s, and looking at the way that, our indigenous populations have been treated as well, the Irish traveller community, it just, that historical context around the border, I think, will open up and understanding. So thank you for your research, and I really look forward to reading it. Thank you.
Final remarks? Alison, I think you'll have the last word. I've been told we do not have time for any more questions. Lunch is ready, but no pressure.
That's
the salient points to make.
Power will go to my head, Daniel. All I wanted to say actually is don't forget that north and south of this border you have human rights acts, and they're pretty much the same. They enable you to rely on the European Convention on Human Rights. No respect to status at all. So whomever you may be, wherever you land, whenever you're here, the Human Rights Act will apply to you. So do remember that, and that applies in relation to treatment and conditions and everything. And we're here. There are the Human Rights Commission here. There's a colleague of mine from the Irish Human Rights Commission down at the back, and we're here to hear the stories and intervene on your behalf if there are any human rights violations. So I just ask you to remember that.
Thank you very much, and that is a very timely comment as well for me to draw attention to something I forgot to say earlier on, which is in pretty similar circumstances, because there are other internal borders within Europe that are supposed to be open within the Schengen area, etc. There have been 2 cases recently in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg that have found that these types of selective passport checks breach the European Convention on Human Rights, which is underpinned by the Human Rights Acts on both sides of the border. Basu versus Germany is one, check on a train. There was no investigation into racial profiling. Mohammed versus Spain is the other. So it's pretty clear that these types of checks are a human rights violation. And perhaps if we can't get this solved politically, litigation will be the way to do it. On that note, your lunch is somewhere through that door out the back.
Thank you, Daniel and the panel, for